Joseph Stalin came to power promising a stronger and stable Soviet Union. But soon, the world realized his rule would only bring suffering unlike anything seen before. And women became his victims, torn from their homes and stripped of their freedom, living in fear and heartbreak every day. It started when Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924. Lenin had been the leader of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and had promised workers and women new rights like voting, divorce, and education. But after his death, those early freedoms quickly began to slip away. On the surface, it looked like the country was slowly healing from the civil war and foreign invasions that had torn it apart after 1917. People hoped the Soviet Union would now move towards stability. But behind the scenes, Joseph Stalin, once thought of as a quiet party member, was already moving to take control. At first, Stalin did not look like the obvious choice. There were other leaders, like Leon Trotsky, who were more famous and more respected. But Stalin was clever. He slowly pushed his rivals aside and placed loyal people in important positions. Within just a few years, he was in full control of the Communist Party. For women, the early 1920s felt like a new beginning. In big cities, they started entering jobs and classrooms that had once been closed to them. Some became doctors or engineers, while others joined local councils or literacy programs run by the Zhenoidyel, the Communist Party's women's department. For the first time, many women felt they had a voice in public life. But when Stalin rose to power, things shifted. He didn't like independent voices. The Zhenoidyel was closed down in 1930. This sent a clear message that women's role was no longer about independence. It was about obedience. Some women managed to survive by keeping quiet. Alexandra Kollontai, one of the first female ambassadors in the world, was sent far away to work in diplomatic posts, which kept her out of Stalin's reach. Others were not so lucky. Many female activists who had fought for equality in the revolution suddenly disappeared from public life, either pushed aside or silenced. The promise of liberation was replaced by fear, and for many women, the nightmare was only beginning. By 1928, Stalin was ready to change farming in the Soviet Union forever. He forced peasants to give up their small pieces of land and join huge collective farms that were controlled by the state. This was called collectivization. Stalin promised it would make farming modern and efficient, but in reality it created chaos. Many peasants resisted. Their land, their cows, their horses, and even their tools were all they had. Giving them up felt like losing everything. Women often stood at the front of this resistance. In many villages, it was the women who confronted officials, hiding food in ovens, burying seeds, or trying to protect the family cow. But the punishment for resistance was brutal. Soldiers and local party officials raided villages, searching homes and beating women who refused to obey. Ukraine was hit the hardest. It was one of the most fertile regions of the Soviet Union. But during 1932-1933, Stalin's grain quotas left nothing for the people themselves. Women watched their children starve, while trucks carried grain away to the state. Mothers sometimes boiled leather, grass, or even tree bark just to give their children something to eat. Some collapsed from hunger while working in the fields and were forced to keep laboring until they dropped. Kazakhstan faced a different but equally tragic disaster. The Kazakh people had lived for centuries as nomads, moving with their herds of sheep and horses. Collectivization destroyed this way of life. Animals were taken away in massive numbers, and soon entire herds died. Women carried the heaviest load, trying to keep their families alive with nothing left to cook. Many dug up roots or boiled weeds. Hunger spread so quickly that whole communities vanished. In southern Russia, stories spread of women walking miles to barter for food, only to be turned away by guards. Some tried to smuggle a few handfuls of grain home, hiding it under their clothes. If caught, they were arrested, beaten, or accused of being thieves. There are records of women being jailed simply for collecting fallen kernels in the fields after harvest. By the end of the famine, millions of lives had been lost. Women not only suffered hunger, but also the grief of burying their children and husbands. Entire families were wiped out, and those who survived were often broken by loss. Yet, instead of admitting the truth, the state blamed the victims. Women were labeled as lazy or accused of sabotaging the farms, even though they were the ones fighting hardest just to keep life going. The darkest chapter came in the late 1930s, when the Great Terror began. It was not only about killing political rivals or silencing critics. It reached deep into ordinary families. In 1937, Stalin introduced a cruel new law. It was called CSER, which meant family member of a traitor to the motherland. This meant that if a man was arrested as a supposed traitor, his wife was automatically considered guilty too. She did not need a trial or evidence. Simply being married to the wrong person was enough. That year, thousands of women were dragged from their homes at night. Families woke to the sound of boots at the door, and children watched their mothers being taken away forever. Even women connected to Stalin's own circle were not safe. Friends of his late wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, were quickly removed from society. Olga Kameneva, who was not only the sister of Trotsky's wife, but also the widow of a leading Bolshevik, was arrested during this time and later executed in 1941. The wives of top military leaders, like Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who himself was accused of plotting against Stalin, were also swept away. They were punished not for anything they had done, but simply for who they had married. The children of these women suffered as well. Many were taken away to state orphanages. There, they were given new names, so that no one could trace them back to their parents. They were told to forget their families and grow up loyal only to Stalin and the Soviet state. While children were stripped of their families, mothers and daughters were shipped off to the Gulag, far away from Moscow and the big cities, deep in Siberia and the Arctic North. These prison camps swallowed millions of lives. Among the prisoners were countless women who were not only political activists, but also teachers, doctors, writers, peasants, workers, and even young girls barely in their teens. In Stalin's eyes, anyone could be an enemy, and women were no exception. Life in the Gulag was almost impossible to survive. Female prisoners were packed tightly into wooden barracks, where dozens of women shared a single space. Most barracks had no proper heating, even though winters in Siberia could drop below -40 degrees. The cold was so severe that frost covered the walls inside the buildings. At night, women huddled together, sharing thin blankets, their breath turning to ice as they tried to sleep. The work they were forced to do was crushing. Women had to chop down massive trees, dig canals, or build railway tracks through frozen ground. They labored 12 to 14 hours every day, often with little food in their stomachs. A normal meal in the camps was just a small piece of bread and a thin, watery soup. Hunger was constant, and many women grew so weak that they collapsed at work. Pregnant women faced even worse suffering. Some were arrested while expecting and gave birth in the camps. There was almost no medical care, no clean water, and no safe place for a baby. Many infants died within days or weeks. Mothers were sometimes forced to go back to heavy labor only hours after giving birth. leaving their newborns with other prisoners who tried desperately to keep them alive. The camps also became places of abuse. In places like Vorkuta and Kolyma, guards treated women as property. Some prisoners were traded for food or cigarettes. Sexual abuse was widespread, and those who tried to resist were punished with even harder work or thrown into freezing punishment cells. Disease spread quickly in the camps. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed thousands of prisoners every year. Women's bodies, already weak from hunger and labor, could not fight off illness. Simple cuts often turned into deadly infections because there were no medicines. Those who died were often buried in mass graves, their names forgotten. Yet even in this darkness, some women tried to hold on to hope. Writers like Evgenia Ginsburg, who was arrested during the purges, later described how women whispered poems to each other or secretly taught one another foreign languages in the barracks, trying to keep their minds alive, even while their bodies suffered. Small acts of kindness, including sharing a crumb of bread, covering a sick prisoner with a coat, kept some alive just a little bit longer. One of the most disturbing and symbolic tragedies of Stalin's rule was the case of Zinaida Rich. She was not just any woman. She was one of the most famous actresses in the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 1930s. Her talent made her a star of the Moscow theater scene, and her beauty and presence on stage made her widely admired. But her life also placed her close to politics and power. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, that was dangerous. Zinaida had been married to the celebrated theater director Vsevolod Meyerhold. He was known across Europe as a revolutionary figure in theater, someone who pushed boundaries and experimented with bold new ideas. But by the late 1930s, Stalin's government no longer wanted bold ideas or independent voices. Everything in art and culture had to follow socialist realism, which meant glorifying Stalin, the Communist Party, and the Soviet system. Meyerhold resisted this, and that resistance sealed his fate. In 1939, Meyerhold was arrested by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. He was brutally tortured for weeks. His body was beaten so badly that he could hardly stand when forced to sign false confessions. Eventually, he was executed, one of the countless victims of the Great Terror. But the punishment did not end with him. Soon after, Zinaida Rich herself became a target. In July 1939, only weeks after her husband's arrest, she was attacked in her Moscow apartment. She was stabbed more than 20 times in a frenzied assault. The wounds showed it was not a random crime. It was personal, violent, and meant to send a message. Officially, the case was never solved. The Soviet press stayed silent, and no one was ever convicted. But few people doubted who was behind it. Many believed Stalin's secret police had ordered her killing to silence her and erase any trace of Meyerhold's influence. Her death showed how even fame and talent couldn't protect women under Stalin's rule. If your husband was marked as an enemy, you were doomed too. Now, as if it wasn't already terrible, World War II broke out, and when Nazi Germany invaded in June 1941, the Soviet Union faced one of the deadliest wars in history. Millions of women stepped forward, not just as helpers, but as fighters. Some became nurses, caring for the wounded in the battlefield. Others trained as snipers, learning to shoot with deadly accuracy. A few even became pilots in famous groups like the Night Witches, women who flew small planes in dangerous night raids against German forces. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the most famous Soviet snipers, killed over 300 enemy soldiers and became a symbol of courage. But the truth was not all glory. Life for female soldiers was extremely hard. They often lacked proper uniforms, boots, and food. Many were treated with suspicion, and some commanders saw them not as equals, but as objects. Reports show that many women were pressured into sexual relationships with officers, while others faced harassment on a daily basis. Some were even sent on near-suicide missions with poor weapons and little training, simply because they were considered expendable. Not all women carried rifles or went to the front. Millions were forced into labor to keep the Soviet Union alive during the war. They worked in factories, fields, construction sites, and even in the forests cutting timber. Entire groups of schoolgirls, some as young as 14, were ordered to dig trenches and build defenses around cities like Moscow and Stalingrad. Many of them had never done heavy work before, but they had no choice. In Central Asia, especially Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, women and young girls spent endless days in the cotton fields. Cotton was vital for making uniforms, tents, and other supplies for the Red Army. Workers stood bent over in the scorching sun, their hands bleeding from constant picking. Food was scarce, but the demand for cotton never stopped. Far to the north and east in the Ural Mountains, women replaced men in the massive factories that produced tanks, planes, and ammunition. They worked in freezing workshops with broken windows, often wearing the same clothes for weeks. The shifts were brutal, sometimes up to 18 hours a day. Women slept on factory floors, waking only to return to the machines. Accidents were common, and many lost fingers, hands, or even their lives. During this chaos, Stalin became deeply suspicious of minority groups inside the Soviet Union. He feared they might help the Germans, even if there was no proof. Because of this, entire populations were punished together. Men, women, children, and the elderly. No one was spared. In February 1944, the Chechen and Ingush people were forced from their homes in the North Caucasus. Soviet soldiers arrived suddenly, giving families little time to gather belongings. People were herded into cattle cars meant for animals, not humans. Inside, there was no heating, no toilets, and barely any space to sit. Women gave birth on the dirty wooden floors, with no doctors, no food, and no clean water. Many babies did not survive the journey. Old people and the sick collapsed along the way. Entire families died before ever reaching Kazakhstan, their bodies sometimes left beside the tracks. The same fate struck the Crimean Tatars, the Kalmyks, and the Volga Germans. Villages emptied in a single day. Women were dragged from their homes, their lives erased in an instant. In Crimea, soldiers arrived before dawn, forcing families onto trucks. Mothers tried to comfort their children, not knowing if they would ever see their homeland again. By the end of 1944, hundreds of thousands had been deported. Exile was almost as deadly as the journey. In Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Siberia, the deported people were left in bare, unfinished houses or sometimes open fields. Winters were brutal, with temperatures dropping far below freezing. Food was nearly impossible to find, and disease spread quickly in the crowded settlements. Women carried the heaviest burden. They tried to keep their children alive while working long hours in collective farms or mines. Many buried not only their parents, but also their own children in the frozen ground. When victory finally came in 1945, people believed the years of terror might be over. Families hoped for peace after so much bloodshed. But under Stalin, peace never truly came. The same system of fear and punishment only grew stronger. For many women, coming home from the war was the beginning of another nightmare. Those who had been taken to Germany as forced laborers, the Ostarbeiter, were not greeted as survivors. Instead, Soviet officials treated them as if they had betrayed their own country. Women who had been starved, beaten, and forced to work in German factories now faced interrogation at home. Security officers questioned them for hours, sometimes days. Many were accused of collaborating just because they had lived on German soil. Thousands were sent straight from freedom in Europe into new chains inside the Gulag. The same suspicion followed female doctors, nurses, and medics who had worked near the front lines. Instead of being honored for saving lives, many were accused of spreading defeatist moods. Some were blamed for losing patients, as if a surgeon could be punished for the death of a soldier in a war filled with chaos. Women who had risked their lives under bombs and gunfire suddenly found themselves wearing prisoner uniforms. Even the widows of men who had died for the Soviet Union were not safe. If their late husbands had once been linked to an enemy or had fallen under Stalin's suspicion, the wives could be arrested years later. Some widows lost everything twice. First their husbands, then their freedom. The Gulag camps swelled again with female prisoners. Between 1945 and 1953, hundreds of thousands of women were sent to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic North. Historians estimate that during these years, about 1 in every 4 prisoners in the Gulag was female. That meant tens of thousands of women at any given time. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin finally died after nearly 3 decades of rule. Crowds filled the streets of Moscow to mourn. But for millions of women across the Soviet Union, his death was not closure. It was only the end of one chapter of suffering. After his passing, the Soviet government began to change, slowly. Within months, political prisoners started to be released. Women walked out of camps after 10, 15, or even 20 years locked away. Some had entered as young wives or mothers, and came back with gray hair and broken bodies. But freedom was not simple. Many returned to find their homes occupied by strangers. Their families had long since moved on or died. Children who had been taken to orphanages or foster homes had grown up without even remembering their real mothers. Reunions, when they happened at all, were often filled with pain, not joy. The country tried to bury the past, but the scars ran too deep. Former female prisoners struggled to find work because the label of enemy never truly disappeared from their records. Some were watched by the secret police for years, even after their release. Others lived in silence, never telling their neighbors or even their own children what had happened to them. Shame, fear, and trauma kept them quiet.